And our next speaker is one of the shining examples, I think I'd have to say, Scott McLeod. He's the Director of Winegrowing at Rubicon Estate in Napa Valley. I've been working with him for quite a few years now, and it's just been a tremendous pleasure to work with him, and I think we're very fortunate to have him here today. So let's give him a warm welcome.
Thank you very much, Deborah. Well, I'll start by saying that I have one goal today, and my goal is that 10 years from now, you'll remember something I presented. I've been to a lot of these seminars in the past, and I think they've really improved. If anyone was at the March rave event that we had here, it was probably the best one we've ever done. And it seems to me that the science is becoming more applied, applicable, certainly to wine growers like myself. And I'm going to follow that thread from what we learned in March in the Phenolic preview and take it into Zinfandel. And I'm going to break open a few myths here about head pruning and about cordon trellis, and I'll let you decide. But I really hope that there'll be something that you'll be able to take away today that will affect you in your wine growing going forward. I'm going to talk about two things. You've been hearing about Zinfandel, the Heritage Clone Project. I'm going to present basically in that case I was about 33 years old. I couldn't wait 14 years to get a Zinfandel clone. The vineyard wasn't going to last that long, and the vineyard that I sourced it from has since disappeared. The second part of my talk is going to be about the phenolics of Zinfandel. I'm going to try to describe a little bit about old vine Zinfandel versus young vine, and what I was hoping for from Dave was that I wanted to hear what he said is old vine character, because to me what he described was texture, and texture does not necessarily mean phenolics, tannins, or anthocyanin, or complex anthocyanin. Perhaps it means that more than anything, maybe it's something as simple as higher glycerin. We don't know. It's a lot to learn. First thing about rescuing an old clone is you have to sort of be honest with yourself and say, how do I know that this clone is truly different than anything that's commercially available? Secondly, why is it important? Do I really need to save that clone? Is that really going to save the world? What are the benefits? What are the risks? How about timing? What's it going to take to do that? Where do I find more information? And most importantly, does the new vine make wine like the old vine? That's probably the number one question. So to answer the first question, well, that's the hard part, is that we don't know. We really don't know that a clone is any different than anything commercially available. When I say sort of, colloquially, that we can't see the difference in clones, what I'm saying basically is that genetically we can't differentiate that level of details significantly of one or two genomes, let alone expression. What we can see is difference between varieties. We can tell that basically Petite Sirah is different than Carignan. And we can tell that, but we can't tell that the clone of Petite Sirah is different than another clone of Petite Sirah. So a lot of things have to play into this thing, and that's why other parts to the puzzle are applicable to the rescue. So why is it important? Why do you want to rescue an old clone? For me it was personal. I looked at these old clones, I looked at this old vineyard, and I said, there's got to be greatness there. And working at a winery that's been in sort of the Zinfandel business since 1879, which was now, formerly was Engelbrecht, is now Rubicon Estate, which we were Niebaum Coppola, but that's a long story. But basically, it's the old property that W.C. Watson founded in 1855 after he married General Yount's daughter. Back in the good old days, you can have my daughter and 1,000 acres with it. And as you go through the process of that, you realize that there's a lot of great California history in Zinfandel. And I don't think any variety sort of strikes a nerve in winemakers, let alone consumers, let alone people inside the industry that like Zinfandel. There's magic to Zinfandel. Maybe it's the story. You heard Charles. Charles didn't write a book on Cabernet. He wrote a book on Zinfandel. And there's a reason for that. There's something about it, and something about it that relates to the California history. So beyond that, I also believe that technology will change. I believe that what we can't see today, we'll be able to see 10 years from now. So if you have a clone that you might be able to rescue, something that might be of significance, well, you know what? Save it. Because 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, we might be able to have the detection available to be able to say that is a clone. So we know what the benefits are, but what are the risks? Well, the risk, obviously, is you take something relatively dirty and you invest a lot of money in replanting, and someone likes 1 on 114 rootstock, or worse, 420A, and then they decide that they want to put a 100-year-old clone of Zinfandel on it. Okay? Well, don't do that. So there's a lot of risk associated with taking vines that are not clean. So what are the costs? I think this is something that people have to look at. This is what I looked at as a relatively young man at 33. It wasn't the dollars, it was the time. So when I say fast track, I made up that word. So it probably doesn't mean anything to anyone probably in academia, but what it means to me is basically, how do I select a vine? How do I know that I've selected a vine relatively free from virus? How do I grow that up into a substantial quantity so that I can therefore turn it into a production block? That's what I call fast track. There's two ways of doing that. The number one way is basically just testing, visuals number one, taking cuttings, running those through either agri-analysis or FPMS here. And the cost, relatively speaking, I looked these up online, they're about $2,000. But those are sort of a pay per go as you go, pay per view. So in other words, $2,000 might mean you tested more samples than you might get lucky. But then again, what are we trying to do? Are we trying to rescue one vine in a 10-acre block, or are we trying to rescue 50 vines in a block to create the same genetic differences in a larger commercial new block? The microshoot tip propagation that Deborah touched on is really the way to go. But again, who's going to wait 10 to 14 years? I couldn't. I physically couldn't. I couldn't wait. I couldn't stare at that long. But we set it up at the same time. And we did it with Cabernet. And Deborah's efforts with our clone of Cabernet, which was the original clone that Captain Niebam brought to Inglenook in 1882, has now been saved. And that's now commercially available. Clone 29 is the original Niebam clone of Cabernet brought to this country in 1882. It's been the foundation of all the Inglenook wine, foundation of Rubicon Estate. So it's wonderful to have a clone that is clean, certified, historically significant, and truly rescued. So where do we find more information? I would send you these two websites first and foremost, and there's really no other place to go. Agri-Analysis, which is here in Davis, it's a private independent laboratory, and then of course FPMS, which is also here in Davis. And both of those websites will get you there. But those are easy to find if you just research ELISA. And ELISA testing, if anyone's familiar with it, it's basically a way of injecting an antivirus. And if the antivirus comes back, then it didn't bind with the virus. If it doesn't come back, then it bound with the virus, which means you have the virus. That's very simplistic. But again, I'm an applied scientist. I'm not a research scientist. That's all I need to know about it. So the last question is, of course, was it worth it? And how do you determine worth? In my case, I'm saying, well, what are the criteria? If your criteria are color or yield, higher ripeness, less virus symptoms, then yes, I can say without a shadow of a doubt that we were very successful and we would do it again. We would absolutely. So let's take it to a practical application of this. This is real life. I rescued 2 old clones of Zinfandel in Rutherford. That's our town, that's where we live. And 2 great old clones, but the 2 great people behind these great clones, which is why it's so much fun. So the 2 names of these, the families were the Morisolis and the Werles. And interesting, both are Swiss-Italian from Ticino. And if you Google Morisoli images, you'll come up with Miss Ticino, who happens to be a Morisoli. So there's a geographical significance. So you look back at Napa Valley, Rutherford, and if you think about, it wasn't old grapes like it is today. So the vineyards were farther apart. Varieties were probably less specific, meaning that we saw with the old blocks where there was, Carignan planted with Zinfandel, et cetera. So the ability to have varied clonal material is obviously much higher than it is today, where monoculture, many more vineyards planted, most of that is 100% varietal in each individual block. So historical provenance then comes into effect. It's like, was it a good clone? What was the implication? How was it interesting? Why was it interesting? Why do you want to save it? Then I'm going to talk to you about the actual rescue efforts and timing, how long it took us and what the results are. Then we're going to taste them even more. So this is why I'm interested. The Inglenook property was named after by a gentleman, a Scot, W.C. Watson, and he married General Yount's daughter. And about 18 years into it, he planted, in 1872, he planted Black Malvasia and Zinfandel. And that's been information I received from Charles, actually, when he wrote the 100th anniversary of Inglenook back in 1979. And anyway, Captain Niebam, a Finn captain, liked Zinfandel. And the original black label claret that he made that said Medoc type on it, just like Charles said, was Zinfandel based. And that's why I brought the 1999 with us out of Magnum, because I think you'll find a lot of characters that perhaps make it feel almost Bordeaux, certainly in terms of perfume at this age, let alone the fact that sort of a relatively soft tannin, relatively moderate acidity. There is some old world character to it, definitely some old world character to it. So anyway, I want to find that clone. And the sad thing is that clone was lost in a transition period when the property was split in 1966, sorry. And what happened was that the family, Daniel family, kept the property, but they sold the brand Inglenook in the front 90 acres. 1973, another group came in and bought it. Zinfandel was removed at that time. The Coppolas came in 1975 with the Williamson Act when the agricultural preserve was set up, and they basically rescued the property so that the Zinfandels could be rescued. But unfortunately, the Zinfandel had left, which is why I'm looking for it. I'm turning over all the old vineyards in Rutherford, hoping to find, at least I can prove to some degree that there's a good chance that we have actually found the original Watson clone of Zinfandel, based off the Morisoli clone, our neighbor. So the Morisoli family from Ticino, they came to Rutherford in 1990, and Plinio, there's a name you don't hear very often, but Plinio was Gallo's first North Coast grape buyer. So needless to say, in a very small industry, he knew everybody. And he came in on Nebom Lane, and he replanted the Zinfandel in 1920, something like that, just post-phylloxera. From there, what he did was, we know that 3 generations of the Morisolis have worked on the estate and still do. Gary Morisoli still works with us. And I have theorized that the original Morisoli planting is probably the original Watson planting. The reason is the timing is just too perfect, and the location is very interesting. So then in 1999, Jean-Michel Boursico from Montpellier came over with Deborah. It was fun. We walked Gary's old 1-acre block, and we found 11 varieties in it. And I mean, there's everything in this thing: Muscat Hamburg, and true Zinfandel, Petite SIRAH, Carignan, certainly everything else that we can probably imagine was there. But in the process of doing that, I realized that when I had seen another Napa Valley winery taking cuttings there in December, that, oh my God, not only did they take virus, but they probably took Muscat Hamburg with them. So you got to be careful. You have to be very sincere about your provenance. So I used to nickname it with Gary as a Christmas clone, because by December, the old stuff was, the leaves were red and the fruit was green. And so I knew it was going to be a rescue effort from hell, but it was worth it. Next, we have the Werle family. And the Werles were great. And this is my favorite story. This is one of the great ones. They got the property because Werle owned a bar in San Francisco. It was a drinking debt. And so he got the property. Instead of paying his bar bill, he got the property. It was the old quarry. And it's right across from the entrance to Quintessa. Not the main entrance, but more the, I guess you'd call the residential entrance, which is just north on the Silverado Trail. It's this wonderful white tufa soil, very, very light, very, very highly reflective, and fascinating. Conrad Werle in the 20s was the one that planted it to Zinfandel. The grapes all went to Gallo, which was pretty typical at the time. Obviously, he knew Plinio Morisoli. And then after that, in the 60s and 70s, the fruit went to Camus. And then Chuck Wagner was actually the first person to take cuttings in the first rescue effort. And Bob Gallagher, if anyone knows Bob Gallagher, who works for Crop Care for the last 20 years, Bob Gallagher is Conrad Werle's grandson. So between Bob Gallagher and Gary Morisoli, there's a lot of spirited conversations about whose is better. Now look at that. That's Conrad. So why wouldn't you want to save that old clone of Zinfandel? By 1966 in Rutherford. So geographical significance, let me just sort of show you here with the pointer. So that's the old Inglenook Estate, Nebom Coppola Rubicon Estate. And this was the original Cabernet planting today. That right there is Gary's old block of Zinfandel and other. And like Ridge, it was sold to Zinfandel until we sort of realized that it wasn't Zinfandel. And what I did was the original cuttings came from here. And back in time with Nebom, to the record, we knew that Zinfandels were planted here in the front. And then probably in 1885, a gentleman named McIntyre, who was the architect, and also the farm manager, who later went to work for Leyland Stanford, then said you should move your Zinfandels higher up in the hills. It's kind of interesting, and that's where they are today. So my hope was that I could find that which was originally here and bring it back to the property. So that was my reason. So I bought it. I hook, line, and sinker. I wanted this thing to happen. But it's fascinating to look. You look at, you take the center of the California wine industry in terms of Cabernet, and they were side by side. There's Inglenook, and it was BV. This is the original BV. That's a micro winery there. And the original winery that Captain Niebaum used to use was way back here. This is where we made Rubicon from 1978 through 1998. And then, of course, that was the test cellars for building the main winery, which is, of course, Zinfandel Chateau. So, how do you rescue an old clone? Firstly, identify what you think is good. Most important thing is the visual symptoms. I mean, obviously, there's nothing better than walking a vineyard and looking for it. And it takes a trained eye. There's a lot. Phosphorus, for example, we see on SIRAH. Phosphorus can make leaves turn virus-like in terms of certainly anthocyanin accumulation. You can see very, very red leaves beginning almost in early, mid-July. And that can make you think that it's a virus when it in fact is not. But on the old stuff, I mean, you're looking at basically cluster morphology. Don't save something with fan leaf. It's not going to do you any good. But you're looking for, good crop levels and certainly the vine symptoms, leaf morphology, and then certainly the cluster morphology, plus overall trunk diameter, which I think is very important in terms of determining vine age, that it truly is an old one. And then take your samples. And the timing of the cutting of the samples, no sense for me telling you now. Just go to the websites if you're interested in doing it. All the documentation, all the information is already there. So then basically you select the cleanest vines. And what I would suggest you do is don't bud more than 10 vines from a parent vine, from a donor. And then you wait and watch. It's a 3-year, you got to grow a vine. And it's good to see that vine, see the cluster morphology, see what the new vine looks like, and see if it's worth saving again. And then from this third generation, the 3-year-old, now it's time to go out there, select again, take your cuttings again, pass ELISA, don't pass ELISA, and then you're ready to go to a increased block. And also, very important, this comes up over and over again today, which is interesting. None of the speakers today, we never got in a room and discussed what we're all going to talk about. But I'm sort of amazed how much my presentation is going to pull from everything we've heard already. Rupestris, there's something about St. George. There's just something about it that works with Zinfandel. There's also a longevity thing. So there must be a longevity aspect to Rupestris, certainly with St. George, and with Zinfandel. And together they make a very long-lived vine. And it has to be through virus resistance because all vines had virus. And how it's able to live 100 years with virus is pretty spectacular. So in other words, never mess with the winning streak. An increased block to 1 acre for all clean vines. Alternative method of much higher risk, which is what happened to me, was that I couldn't find enough clean vines in Gary's block to basically do anything more than about 4 vines. So now I've got a risk. I'm going to take 4 vines, I'm going to turn 4 or 6, and those are going to become my entire block. Obviously, my risks have been significantly increased because I'm pulling from a smaller sample. So basically, it worked for us until we put it on 3309 and 10114. And basically what happened was that, we're testing for viruses that we know we have antiviruses for. But what happens if leaf roll 6, 7, 8, and 9 haven't been discovered yet, but you put it on 10114 and they say, I don't know what it is, but it hurts. So get it off me. And that's basically what happens. So this is Gary's old block. And first thing you always look at, all right, there's some clusters there. We've got fruit, number 1. Well, actually, that's number 2. Number 1, it's Zinfandel. You're amazed how many people took cuttings from here that were not Zinfandel. Lyre-shaped petiolar sinus, slight tomentose, cluster morphology, all of those things will tell you it's Zinfandel. And if you don't know, you can be tested. FPMS can test varietal. So it's another way of ensuring your investment. But then crop apparent, low shatter, good vigor, trunk diameter, very important. Obviously, it's an old vine. And even more importantly, flagging tape. That was mine from 1994. And basically what that is okay, that was a vine that was selected, numbered, categorized, and then took it into the field. In the case of Werle, I love this photograph. This is 1960s, yellow leaves at harvest. Very important. Varietal, I can see the Zinfandel leaves there. Good crop, good vigor, large trunk diameter, and it had plus a 5-gallon oil can picking box. Okay, so you know it's Zinfandel. And this vineyard's gone, by the way. This was it was purchased, the old quarry vineyard it was called. It was purchased by Nestle executive, wasn't in the wine business, but it's all Cabernet now. That's gone forever. So then the actual testing part. What this is, ELISA, it's an acronym for enzyme-linked immunosera assay. And basically injection of an antivirus. If it comes back, there is no virus. If it doesn't come back, there is a virus. And so you go through your sample list there. This was Morisoli, first pass. Everything in red basically had some problem, whether it was leaf roll 1 through 4. Corky bark is the one that we keep showing up. But we also know that, okay, of all of those that you're going to have, that's probably the one I would worry least about. The one I worry most about, obviously, PD, but the chances are that vine wouldn't have been there. Fan leaf is the sort of, that's the nemesis of Rutherford. That's what we have more of, that we really fight. But the Werle was interesting. Werle was much cleaner. If you look at the Werle, I mean, basically, out of the 6 samples, only 2, and they're both corky bark. Surprise, surprise. So just the first pass tells me that, based on the visuals, Werle appears to be cleaner than the Morisoli. So in the nursery block, what happened with the Morisoli, we had such a small amount of parent material that I had to take more buds from individual vines and create an increased block. So each donor vine, of course, has to receive its specific row. And I put this on Paulson. And I like 1103 a lot because 1103, one of the parents is St. George, but it's a cross with the Berlandiera. And what I like about that is that it seems to have a higher nematode resistance, believe it or not. And what I see with it has less, I would say, wet spring negative in terms of leaf chlorosis or any type of poor growth in the spring. It's got a higher wet feet potential than St. George by itself. Then we grow into mature vines, and then, of course, you're testing again. You're taking your secondary wood from 3-year-old vine. So then the fun part, or the not so fun part, is when you take them in now they're a 3-year-old vine. And in terms of Morisoli, whoops, pardon me. In terms of Morisoli, look at that. One got through, corky bark. So corky bark made it through. Well, it's good to know now, right? I've only invested a 1/4 acre, better than 10 acres. In terms of the Werle, spotless, clean on all counts. But don't forget, that's only leaf rolls 1 through 4. And so if there are other leaf rolls out there, I don't know about it. It's like I went to the doctor today to get my heart checked. How's your heart? Fine. You got a broken leg. I don't care. My heart's fine. You know. So in this case, it's basically what we look for. We're good. But there's probably something else out there. And that's a beautiful site. That happens to be the Morisoli Zinfandel out of the gate block from which Deborah took the Morisoli clone for the Heritage Selection Program. And I can't tell you how much better this looks than the old block. I mean, what you want to see is very uniform growth, yellow going, or green going to yellow, very important. Nice even vigor if you look down that. And the yields consistently 3 tons an acre, starting at closer to 6, then down to 3. So part 2 is Phenolics. How many people went to rave last March? Okay, so I thought last March was, basically it was enough to sort of, unwind your brain a little bit, stretch it out, try to put it back together again. And I think everybody left here thinking, wow, that was really something. But what does it mean? And so I think the Harbison-Adams assay has been developed here at UC Davis with both now Dr. Harbison and Doug Adams. And basically I call it the wine x-ray. It's a way of basically looking into a wine under maceration conditions and be able to see basically how much color, how much tannin, and basically all the structure of a wine early in a wine's life. So we're going to try to apply the assay to old vine versus young vine. And now I'm using 30-year-old as old and I'm using 10 as young. But can we find the magic in old vine and young vine? I'm not sure that we can. But then basically, though, what is magic? I think Dave would have said something different than I might say. But also, what's the seasonal differences? How often do these things change? And then is there vine age difference? Do they affect it on a seasonal basis? What happens when you irrigate an old vine? I think something we didn't have a chance to ask Dave. He's unfortunately had to leave early, but irrigating an old vine must make different wine than he made when he was not irrigating those old vines. And everything I have currently on the young vine, just so everyone is clear, is that all my young vine is on cordon with drip irrigation with trellis. So part of the phenolic assay that they came up with was basically it's an in-house sort of a wet chemistry method of measuring colors, tannins, total phenols, and also what we call small polymeric pigment, which is basically how many tannin and how many anthocyanins combine. And then, of course, large polymeric pigment, which is how many of the small ones become. So anthocyanin, or color, I think most people would confirm it as color. It's measured by a spectrophotometer at 520 nanometers. Tannin, measured by protein precipitation. It's a pain, it's difficult. Hire an intern, that's what they're for. Small polymeric pigment, SPP, it's a tannin plus an anthocyanin, less than 5 molecules in length, and this is all basically subjective to their test. This is what they came up with, 5, I don't know why 5 and not 6. Large polymeric pigment, LPP, is basically SPP with another SPP with another SPP, greater than 5 molecules in length. As you would imagine, SPPs must form first, LPPs would form after that. Total phenols, which are iron reactive, measured by spec at 510. That's something that all of us can do. So if you were to take this and apply it in September, figure out how to do anthocyanin, figure out how to do the total phenols. You already have a spec most likely in the lab for doing malates or enzymatics, whatever. So you already have the material. But those two alone can probably, my belief, can improve winemaking by at least 25%. Non-tannin phenols, monomers, it's a calculation, total phenols, less a tannin calculation. And what would that be? That would be like catechins, seed-derived tannin, perhaps negatives. So that's a small number, that's a good number. So it's all about dance partners. Small polymeric pigment, 1 tannin and 1 anthocyanin. Large polymeric pigment, multiple. All right. Everybody have coffee? Okay, so basically this is where the whole thing falls apart, okay? We're here because we love Zinfandel, we love to farm it, we love to drink it, we love to look at it. And now I'm going to ruin it by bringing in a Cabernet philosophy. But I'm going to explain a lot of the questions that came up in the previous topics. Old vine versus young vine, 31 on St. George versus 10-year-old on Paulson, but it's irrigated. So this is the gate Morisoli, gate Werle, and day 1 in the fermenter, this is post-crush. Nice increase, popping up almost to 800 milligrams per liter. These are milligrams per liter, both the tannin and the anthocyanin. They're identical units, they're very easy to compare. And don't forget, it's the dance partners, a ratio of 1 to 1. What's interesting is that the old block started out much lower in free anthocyanin, and they almost track to where they start. There's an earlier peak, which might be fermentation temperature here on day 6. The dry farmed old blind peaked at day 9. They both kind of fell, and then they both leveled out or perhaps increased a little bit. What's amazing about the Morisoli and the Werle, I asked Tandy, I said, Tandy, did we blend these here? And we looked up the record, we didn't. These two blocks, we were grown side by side, actually ended up within 5 parts per million of anthocyanin within each other, which is fascinating because at one point they were as high as 150, 200 parts of color different. So, takeaway, starting color, ending color, low, low, high, high. So if I'm a winery and I'm buying 20 lots of Zinfandel, and I do a color measurement on days 1 through 5, and I have 3 growers, 1, 2, and 3, and I find that, wow, Fred's Zinfandel is higher color than Ted's Zinfandel, which is higher color than Ed's Zinfandel. In the process, and then I find out that I actually followed all the way to the end of the fermentation. That's pretty important news. And then if organoleptically I prefer, just by chance, the one with higher color, perhaps I found a quality matrix I can apply evenly to growers and able to determine perhaps pricing or who I'm going to keep and who I'm not going to keep. In terms of an estate product, I'm going to look at that in terms of Tier 1 program, Tier 2 program. So let's look at TANNIN, because we need dance partners. Wow, that's amazing. Why are they so even? Well, are they? Yeah, that's, in terms of phenolics, that's pretty amazing, right? That's basically pretty even. And then here are the 2 young vines. I mean, it's unbelievable how they track. So basically, what do we see? Same thing, slower start, peak, similar to where the color was day 9. Slight fall, evens out. Old vine, higher tannin. 300 parts higher tannin. That's 30%. Significantly higher tannin. Enough to make you wonder why. So then, let's take a look at an old vine fermentation all by itself. This is an old block. This is old cow barn. This was planted in 1973. And basically, tannins are always last out of the gate. Colors are always ahead. What you're looking for is this peak here. It's nice because they are dance partners after all. So 1-to-1 is what we're looking for. So in this case, we have 650 parts of color, but we have over 1,000 parts of tannin. So we have significantly more tannin than there is anthocyanin. So chances are, if the tannin doesn't bind with an anthocyanin, it's either going to be free tannin, which is going to affect us in sensory, perhaps it's going to precipitate itself out. But this tail is something that we're talking to other people who run the analysis are finding is very interesting, and we don't know exactly what that is. Why would colors all of a sudden, after they've been falling for 3 days, all of a sudden increase? Why would tannin that started to fall? And what's interesting, look at that slope. Almost identical. What does that mean? Dance partners. So these tannins and these anthocyanins are probably forming small polymeric pigment. Well, what the hell is this? Maybe what we're thinking is that maybe this is cell degradation, and so that the actual guts of the grape, which have protein, after the alcohol has reached 13-14%, might have basically released those proteins, just like we see with cold stability in white wine, so that actually maybe once the alcohols basically denature the protein, tannins and colors come out again in solution. So what does that mean about short macerations versus long macerations? Well, depending on where you go to press this, you've got 3 very different wines. All the more reason to run this analysis. Let's break it down. There's a great question back here about cold soak. What does cold soak do? I'll tell you what cold soak does. This is what cold soak does. I can prove this on every variety we've done. Cold soak liberates anthocyanin, free anthocyanin, before tannin. I don't know what it does to flavor. I don't know what it does to specific varietal character, pyrazines, for example, in Cabernet. I don't know. But I can tell you, and you can go out and tell everyone else, that cold soak releases color ahead of tannin. What varieties need tannin? Pinot Noir. Some Zinfandels. So if I cold soak Pinot Noir and all my color comes out but my tannins don't, and if my colors don't have a dance partner, where do they go? They fall out. And so I could make an argument that cold soak with Pinot Noir is a bad idea. The reason is that you need dance partners. And so if my colors are here, and they're never really going to get over 400 on Pinot Noir anyway, it's a lower color variety, and I don't have tannin to bind with them, they're gone. They'll bind back to a protein in the grape skin. And also I could say, of all varieties, Pinot Noir is probably one variety you might want to macerate over 13 days. So that's the cold soak. So everybody knows what cold soak does. Cold soak liberates anthocyanin. So what we do is we cold soak 4 or 5 days, depending. And what we do is we'll bring them in, pick early as we can, and then turn the jackets at 50 degrees. So we chill them. Once they're in the tank, we chill them. So mid-firm. Fascinating. Okay, so what's happening now? Temperatures are increasing, yeasts are active, skins are a little softer. Look out. Here comes tannin. Finally, put me in, coach. Here come the tannins. Right? And that slope, what we're finding is that slope is relative to the total amount. Steeper the slope, more there is. Less of a slope, less there is. But look at that. That's what you're looking for, is that your tannins are peaking with your anthocyanin, all your dance partners. And if this had been moved to starting that fermentation on the first day, heating the tank and getting it going, Well, this would have been here, but my peak color would have been here. And so I could make an argument that if I had done that, I would have made with Zinfandel what happened with many mountain Cabernets in Napa in the 70s. They started fermenting the same day, often inoculating when the grapes arrived. And this tannin would just jump out of the ground, and the color's a little slower, and then you're pressing because your tannins are so god-awful in quantity, but you're pressing before you achieve full color extraction in your day 6, day 7, day 8. Pretty cool stuff. So, what did we learn? It's amazing, we ran the numbers. Note to self, 47% of color, but only 5% of tannin were extracting during 4 days of cold soak at 55 degrees. That's pretty unbelievable. So, almost half of our color comes out in cold soak. So why do we cold soak? Color. Front-loading the reaction. Basically, it's a Sadie Hawkins dance. All the women are lined up, then the men come in. Or vice versa. And so, in the case of having very tannic varieties, that's what you want. You want to front-load the color so that when the tannins do arrive, they have a dance partner, and you're able to press, perhaps, before your tannins go off the chart. Makes perfect sense. So, now we get into the guts of it. This is the boring part. Small polymeric pigment, large polymeric pigment. These are not that easy to run. I don't personally do these, okay? I look at the results. So, small is the blue. And so, through the fermentation, through cold soak, there's a little bit of increase. As it warms up, of course, you have tannin now. Tannins are binding with anthocyanins, forming small polymeric pigment. It's probably a bad number. Right around the same time we saw the peak in color in tannin, we see the peak in the small polymeric pigment. And they keep going. Large polymeric pigment, that's probably a bad number. It trails, of course, as it should, because it takes small polymeric pigment before you form large polymeric pigment. And then, basically, what we see with Zinfandel and Old Vine is that we don't necessarily see more increased anthocyanin, complex anthocyanin formation with Zinfandel. Just what it is. We just don't see it. Maybe it takes longer. Maybe it takes 6 months for these small LPPs to become LPPs. We don't know. But it's interesting. But the SPPs really track well with the extraction curve, but the large polymeric pigment did not. With Cabernet, I can show you that there's a much more similar, one follows the other. So the summary, regardless, I didn't say conclusion because these are summaries. These are, I believe that the cold soak is very effective with Zinfandel, provided you have really good tannic Zinfandel, really good serious Zinfandel. Because they're able to, we've seen upwards of 60% of the total anthocyanin being released in cold soak in 4 days. So maximum total anthocyanins seem to peak multiple trials, 8 to 9 days. And tannins in Zinfandel are not infinite as they are with Cabernet. What we see with Rutherford Cabernet is that the longer we leave them in that maceration, our tannins will increase daily. We also know that Zinfandel has a very uneven ripe. This is an additional comment. But basically, I think that the head training, because of sort of two things. One is the apical dominance. I think if you were to measure auxin levels in the highest shoots on a vine versus the lower shoots on the vine, you'd find a difference there. So we already know Zinfandel's uneven. Luckily, someone else presented that to me before I got up here. And so what we know, what I feel, is that by putting them on a cordon, I've eliminated apical dominance, and I've been able to basically, with irrigation, manage the heat spells like Dave is doing now with his Old Vine. And I believe we can, by creating a uniform exposure, I can much easier create the phenolic window that I'm looking for. So, interesting point I've sort of seen is that maybe Old Vine Dry Farm Zinfandel, on the goblet or on the head training, we always know that we have a lot of raisins in there. If you look at those raisins carefully, they're not black. They're sort of a pinkish rosé color. So my feeling is that we probably lose color with raisining on an individual berry basis, but tannins are much slower to degrade, and they probably concentrate tannin. So there's a possibility that with the Old Vine slide I showed is that the tannin increase was maybe due to raisining. Not sure about that. But I also believe that irrigation reduces raisining, which probably increases final color because less berries raisin. Raisining loses color. And it may lower tannin, but probably just because we don't have less raisins. So another part of the summary, these are not replicated trials. And so I don't want you to leave here thinking that this is the word of how this works with Zinfandel. This is what we did at our place with our wines. But there's enough here that if we had more time, we would definitely look into it. So I also didn't compare rootstock trials or blocks versus blocks, irrigated, non-irrigated. But there's so much to learn. I mean, this whole experiment basically just unlocks all sorts of possibilities. You know, wings and shoulders, depths of irrigation, crop levels in phenolics, rootstocks in phenolics, grower block quality assessment tool. I mean, there's a lot you can do with it. And if you were just to take it to the two most important points that you could apply in September, color and total phenols, and you got two pretty good, the total phenols you'd use almost like tannin. You'd see them increase daily, and then you'd sort of see them, once you sort of organoleptically kind of know where your window is, then you might be able to apply that to sort of where you think you want to be. But I'll caution you in that we've done a lot of work on Cabernet, and what we see is that, take a year like 2004 versus 2003 versus 2005. 03, 05, long seasons, all the way into the 1st of November. 04, short and hot. And what we see is that it could just be the amount of protein or available protein inside a berry that when one's crushed, goes out, grabs onto a tannin, grabs onto anthocyanin, and doesn't let it go until day 12. Of course, what happens in a short, hot harvest like 04 is that your total picking window has been reduced by 30 days. And so you're under pressure to turn your tanks over faster. And that invariably it means you're going to take a day, maybe 2 days out of your cold soak. What we saw with 04 is that 04 was actually about 40% of the anthocyanin was released in 4 days as it was in 2003. In other words, probably more protein grabbing onto tannin, grabbing onto color, so that it was not able to let it go and see it in solution. So one thing I would say, short harvest, like what we might have in terms of available days, it sort of goes against what we want to do, but my guess is that you need to increase your cold soak time in shorter vintages. Say vintage would be from, I would say, flowering to harvest. Before that doesn't really matter. I'd say from flowering to harvest, you look at that period of days, there's probably a ratio to the amount of cold soak days you need, provided you have a tannic variety. Bonus feature, I thought this would be fun. Zinfandel and Petite SIRAH. Yes, Julia Roberts and Lyle Abbott were married for, I think it was 7 days. I want to see if Phenolics can solve this puzzle. So what do we know about Zin? Everything everybody's said today so far. Less color, less tannin. Yeah, arguably, you can use some color, you can use a little bit of tannin. But we know it can be pushed around a little bit. If you were to put something like Cabernet and Zinfandel, you can taste it within 5-10% certainly. Petite SIRAH, what do we know? High color, high tannin, all those things that we talked about. Little goes a long way. Similar flavors, thin skin, it's worked quite well. So if you look at, here's a Morisoli young vine, and we look at extraction, now you know that that must have been a cold soak. Great peak, about 650. That's a great lot of Zinfandel. I would argue that Zinfandel doesn't need Petite SIRAH. Colors peak out right there at day 10, day 11. Surprise, surprise. Here's a good lot of Zin. This isn't a great lot of Zin. Cold soak. Colors really peaked. We had almost 60% of the total color at that period of time. Tannins took off about 600-700. Yeah, okay. Could probably use some color. Definitely can use some color. So what we see on a not so good lot is also SPP formation. It's okay, but the LPP, the large primary pigment, is not that great either. So overall, this is not that much phenolic material, basically, the takeaway. Petite SIRAH, just look at it, right? And remember, in terms of the slope, perhaps indicating the total quantity, it's a pretty good measure. And so look at the color. During cold soak, you can tell how do you know it's cold soak? Because there are no tannins. I mean, you can look at these graphs and say, they started fermentation right there. That's when I turned the jacket to 85 degrees. Launched that rocket. But the color in such a high color variety, even during cold soak, the colors came out almost 50%. So anyway, it's true. There's a lot of color, a lot of tannin in Petite SIRAH. Proved it. And then if you look at the SPP, the small polymeric pigment, the dance partners, it's off the charts. It's double that of Zinfandel on a good lot of Zinfandel. SPP, LPP is coming up right behind it. So no question about it. If you want to add phenolic material to Zinfandel, add Petite SIRAH. There's a reason. It's great logic, great historical significance to adding Petite SIRAH. How much is too much? Here's what we did. This is pretty fun. we took side-by-side trial, and we added to one of this is a low tannin Zinfandel. We added 1 ton to 9 tons for a 10% Petite Sirah addition, and the other was the control. Petite Sirah, that was what we saw previously, and this was the Zinfandel we saw previously, which is the good lot, not the great lot. But look what happened with a 10% addition. A 10% addition of Petite Sirah to a good lot of Zin increased total anthocyanin by 46%. So you want to add color? It's the right variety, that's for sure. And at 10%, you could argue that you probably haven't pushed around the Zinfandel character. But then, okay, what about tannin? Are we going to add that much tannin? No, similar to what we saw before. Petite's way up here, but adding the 10% Petite only raised tannins by 5%. There we see it again. We see that the anthocyanin, definitely a big increase with the Petite, but we don't see it in the tannin on the Zinfandel. So maybe you achieve everything with just a little bit of Petite Sirah. Same thing goes, SPP and LPP, similar, little increase, but nothing too. Summary, cold soak is very effective with Zinfandel and Petite Sirah blends. See upwards of 45% of the total color. Tannins in Zinfandel, Petite co-fermentation are not infinite, meaning that there is sufficient anthocyanin, sufficient tannin, but it does run out. Thanks to Tandy, who works with us, Drs. Harbison and Adams, Deborah, of course, Gary Morisoli and Bob, either for being too broke or too stubborn to replant the Zin, Francis for not removing the Zin as advised by experts in 1975, Jim Wolpert for all the great work, Kay Bogart and the Trellis Alliance, of course, and the FPMS and agri-analysis. And in memory of Glenn Freibertshauser, does everybody know Glenn? Anybody knew Glenn? He ran agri-analysis, he and his wife Kathy, and he passed away to cancer just recently. But without Glenn, we never would have rescued those 2 old clones because you couldn't risk someone else's money on budwood like that. And Glenn saved us, he really did. And then I just got to say 2 things about this funding initiative that's going to be hopefully coming upstream. The department needs money. We need to self-fund ourselves. We need to create some form of getting funds back to the university so they don't have to have bake sales, and be able to create a body of monies that will allow research to continue, not stop and start. And what we need to do is what the Australians do, which is just basically assess ourselves on tonnage. And the Pierce disease assessment has been very, very effective. I think everyone's known that there are now certified hybrids, Chardonnay and Cabernet, that's why I put them in parentheses. They're resistant to Pierce disease. They're 87% vinifera, but they're resistant to Pierce disease. This university just saved the Texas wine industry. I suggest there's so much more they could do with U-type and leaf roll, of course. And then I suggest just a half of 1% assessment for the wineries buying grapes and 0.25% for growers selling grapes, for a total of 0.75%. On 1,000 tons, the winery pays $5 and the grower pays $2.50. Having guaranteed yearly funds will stabilize the department, stabilize research, and the research projects will be governed by us. And we have a lot of things coming up. We've got a new pest every couple of years, it seems. We have global warming. We have increased global competition. And certainly we have increased population in the state of California. So spread the word. We need to get moving on this. I'm working on it personally in Napa, trying to get just one county. And we all have to realize that research drives profits. Everything we heard today was based off of funds that were very hard to come by. And it's just, this university is really at the point where they need some funds on a guaranteed yearly basis. Thanks for your time.